Alrighty. So today, this discussion is going to be focused on extending topicality arguments versus a set of affirmatives that read plans. The goal of this lecture is to help you optimize your strategy, your organization, and execution of topicality arguments in the negative block in the 2NR against affirmatives that read a traditional plain text. And at the end, I'm going to take a couple of questions so that you all can have sort of your concerns answered. I wanted to start this conversation with the rationale for why topicality is a vital part of the negative arsenal on the CJR topic. As you likely realized from week one of affirmative construction, criminal justice includes a vast array of areas. While it might be ideal to write case nags to 1,000 affirmatives under each category, debate is frankly just one extracurricular activity in your otherwise busy life, and unless you plan to never sleep, it's not really realistic to be able to complete case-specific research for all of the affirmatives that 2As would fancy to be related to criminal justice. Crafting a good T-file in the preseason and being able to execute on some violations is critical for your negative win percentage. Learning how to effectively debate topicality has 3 other benefits. The first is that topicality has good synergy with a set of agent and process counterplans. So if you're somebody who likes to read a set of counterplans of the court's executive, topicality definitely is something that you want to learn. Being able to effectively debate T and ACT, for example, serves as a pseudo A-spec argument that allows you to establish competition against vague plans on this topic. In a lot of other topics, my guess is that, you sort of heard, A-spec violations generally as a joke, or, maybe they were extended if they were conceded by the other team. I do think that in this topic, right, T and ACT essentially is making an A-spec argument. If a team sort of refuses to specify past USFG in the plan, you can use the cards you'd read on T and ACT to establish competition. So, for example, you can use the word enact to establish that a court's counterplan or executive counterplan is competitive because enact requires congressional involvement. Or read a definition of enact that requires both houses and the executive to sign, and read a process counterplan like the veto-cheeto counterplan. Second benefit for being able to effectively debate topicality. I think topicality is vital if you want to be a K debater on the negative. This seems kind of counterintuitive, but really isn't. So although at a first glance, Afro-pessimism and abolitionist critiques of CJR, as a resolutional term seem promising, widening the scope of what enact CJR in sub-areas like forensic science, policing, sentencing, make those critiques less applicable, right? So for example, if the affirmative team wins that forensic science includes the investigation of the trafficking of nuclear materials, your link arguments about criminal justice reform that's speaking to the policing of black bodies has at best a tangential relationship. Anecdotally, there was actually a whole year in which this Peninsula team of Ram Tambe fame won a majority of their affirmative debates against pessimist critiques because they picked tangentially topical affirmatives with plans on the education and the China topic that sort of made a negative strategy a lot more frustrating. They were able to make a set of 2 AC arguments that anti-blackness didn't explain the specificity of the fringe of the topic that they had chosen. Being a good T debater, on the other hand, forces your opponents to read more topical affirmatives that you're more prepared to read specific links to. The third reason, and the third benefit for why you want to learn T, is learning how topicality debates are optimized on the negative will help you learn the best way to execute some of the fringe affirmatives on this topic. Some of you all love reading squirrely or small affirmatives, right? Small affirmatives are only successful if the affirmative debaters are more confident about debating generics like process counterplan competition, critiques, and especially T. So learning what good and bad T extensions are on the negative will help you deploy smaller affirmatives and squirrely affirmatives successfully. Now that we've discussed the rationale for learning how to debate T, or why we should learn to debate T on the negative, let's talk about sort of strategizing these negative T debates. I want to start by saying that one of the big weaknesses of this topic for the purposes of T is that there are a few words in this resolution that are generally ill-defined, right? So in particular, the forensic science area is one that has little exclusive definitions and is not the best place to generate negative topicality arguments. Generally speaking, my suggestion for T is to sort of focus on these four big areas. First is T enact. I think there's a healthy, somewhat neg-leaning debate that enact implies only no legislative action. The second is T criminal, not civil. I think there's also a somewhat neg-leaning debate that criminal justice is distinct from civil justice. So in civil justice, there's not really crimes. They're actually called torts. The difference is that attorneys, right, so the prosecutor in a criminal case generally defends the government, not the victim for criminal law. And the standard for evidence is also different. So in a criminal court, the standard for evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt. And for civil courts, it's a preponderance of evidence. And while these things seem a little bit similar, beyond a reasonable doubt is something that is a little bit more expansive. So to be sort of determined to be a criminal, right, there needs to not just be a lot of circumstantial evidence, but there needs to be no reasonable doubt for you to be guilty. So there's a bunch of sort of distinct ways that criminal and civil cases play out pretty differently. And that's why I think there's maybe a neg-leaning sort of defense of this set of T violations. The third kind of T violation that I think you need is a T argument against bidirectionality. So the phrase bidirectionality is the idea that a topic can sort of go both directions. Obviously, right, bidirectionality. The way to sort of think about this is this way. So considering your last couple of topics, like you may have debated on the education or immigration topic or arms sales topic, they always had a direction. So the arms sales topic always was like, we'll reduce arms sales. So the negative got to say, perhaps we should increase or keep them the same. On the immigration topic, it was about the federal government was reducing some of the criteria needed to become an immigrant. For the education topic, you were increasing regulations. So there was always sort of one direction. For this topic, it's a little bit less conclusive. The word enact, CJR, may or may not determine a direction. In fact, a couple of labs, right, the KM lab, I think the GG lab is also working on this too, is working on a set of like white collar crime affirmatives that increases the policing for white collar criminals. I think writing a set of topicality arguments, even though the evidence is not conclusive either way, that sort of bidirectionality should be restricted and that enacting criminal justice reform means reducing punishment is going to be pretty important. I think that even though the evidence is not going to be great, the judging community that you'll sort of see yourself in will find it intuitive that a bidirectional or multi-directional set of affirmative mechanisms are kind of a disaster for negative brain. The fourth T argument that I would suggest sort of investing time in when putting together your T file is T in the United States. So to avoid the states counterplan, there are a number of areas that affirmatives may try to write squirrely affirmatives around. So some that come to my mind off the top of the head. So military prisons is one area where the states obviously have no jurisdiction and teams might sort of be like, this is sort of in the fringe of in the United States. Another one might be sort of the Uniform Code of Military Justice on military bases. So not just military prisons, but perhaps a set of criminal justice rules that occur on bases in different countries. So the United States has bases in places like Germany, Japan, etc. And there are a set of criminal justice rules that are related to the United States, right? Another example might be devolving criminal justice reform for our territories. So perhaps devolving sort of the decisions made about sentencing and policing in Puerto Rico to the Puerto Rican government or to Guam or to other US territories. I think that negative T arguments here are pretty important because some of your counterplans might not make a lot of sense here. And there are some good negative arguments that in the United States implies a geographic scope or just the 50 states and nothing else. So those are sort of four places where I would start with a topicality argument that's fairly compelling. In my perspective, there are other T violations, but those other T violations either have sort of an issue with creating a legally precise definition, a definition that has an intent to define, or just, is good at all. So, the sort of struggle for this topic is that there are not a lot of words that have very clear intents and definitions, but there are a couple of core violations that I think will help limit out sort of the worst excess of the set of affirmatives that you're debating. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about a set of 1 and Cs that you might be able to read, I want to sort of talk about some considerations of strategy when thinking about topicality. So the first sort of conception that I want to talk about is that it's all about limits. It's all about limits. So Ken Strange, the former legendary director of Dartmouth and this institute, taught me this particular lesson. The question of T is fundamentally only one of limits. Every other standard on topicality, be it ground, education, or otherwise, are of a secondary relationship. So I'm going to repeat that because I do think that this is fairly important. Limits is fundamental. Every other standard on topicality, be it ground, education, or otherwise, are of a secondary relationship. Why is that true? Well, if you think about sort of ground arguments, right, no one has sort of a God-given right to ground. There's not really any argument that the negative must have, including the abolition K, the state's counterplan, the politics dissent, or agent counterplans. There are, plenty of topics in which those are not the core positions that are necessary, right? There's also incidentally always ground. There's always something to say against any normative proposition. So it might be true that, you're not prepared to debate affirmatives on the space topic. So like if I decided to read space elevators on this topic, it seems like that's not really a criminal justice reform. But ground arguments tend to get it sort of backwards, right? It's not like there's no ground against space elevators. I certainly can cut a set of negative arguments against that AF. It's simply that we can't predict it. So, the decision about ground arguments ultimately is based on a predictable limit that divides affirmative and negative ground, right? So the limits is the thing that sort of determines whether or not a set of ground is important. Think sort of the same thing about education. So I think both affirmative and negative arguments about education tend to be pretty weak. Education is kind of inevitable. We're always learning something. So, if the affirmative reads a Korea affirmative from the college alliances topic in round 1 of your season opener, right, there's no doubt that you might learn something about US defense backs and Korea policy. But your argument essentially, again, comes back to limits, right? How do we maximize that education such that both sides are able to anticipate, research, and engage the same topic without one side having a monopoly on the information? The reason why I sort of lead with it's all about limits is that I think a lot of affirmative and negative teams often waste time making standards arguments that are not related to this core question of limits, right? I could make one of my standards to, T enact as no courts that there's a loss of negative ground in the form of Congress links and the writer dissent. Boo-hoo, right? Who cares? You don't have a God-given right to sort of the writer dissent or a Congress link to the politics dissent. And the only determination of whether that ground should be given to the negative is contingent on you winning that you have the least arbitrary and most predictable limit on the topic. As an affirmative, making the argument that education about courts is good is worthless if you haven't won the prior limits argument that court action is in fact included in the word enact. So yeah, like learning about courts, you might learn a thing or two, but there's no reason why sort of in the competitive context of debate that is a good thing to learn about, right? So it's just like the set of sort of ground arguments and education arguments people make generally are a waste of time. And I think that, limits arguments are sort of the way that you want to think about the negative consistently. The second sort of strategic consideration that I'm going to include, this one is a little bit short, but I think should be intuitive, which is that the more that the 2AC says on topicality, the less topical that they are. So in high school, I think students have a tendency to run away from debates. So when they see 2-minute 2ACs on topicality on a clearly non-topical affirmative, they decide it's too much of an investment and instead decide to extend a different off-case position. Absolutely not. You should not do that, right? The more the 2AC is saying on topicality, the more willing you should be willing to take the challenge. Like, for example, the 13th Amendment Act. My guess is that the 2AC on T sentencing is going to be pretty long. That's an indication that you should be going for topicality, not an indication that you should run away from it, right? Don't run away from class. You should embrace it. You're in debate, not discussion. Now that we've talked a little bit about some strategy things, the next thing that I want to talk about is how do I optimally organize and execute a topicality speech in the negative block? I think there's a couple of considerations under this. The first is time management. My general rule of thumb for an extension for topicality in the negative block is to add 2 minutes to the amount of time the 2AC spent covering topicality. So to repeat that, my rule of thumb for an extension for topicality is to add 2 minutes to the amount of time that the 2AC spent covering topicality. If that means the 2AC on T and ACT was 45 seconds, you're hoping to cover in about 2:45. If that means the 2AC on T for a fringe affirmative was 2 minutes, you're hoping to cover in about 4 minutes. It should not be the case that your T speech is taking an entire 1 in R, or God forbid, the majority of your 2 in C. And as a result, your topicality argument must be efficient, right? It must be efficient. Your goal ultimately is to read a bunch of different strategies so the 1AR does not have enough time to cover the topicality argument that you're making, sufficiently, right? And your sort of goal then, that means, is not to sort of, wax poetic, but to try to be maximally efficient. The second sort of thing to think about when optimally organizing is easy, flowable, and numbered sound bites. Easy, flowable, and numbered sound bites. Although I did just say your T speech must be efficient, it can't be so short and blippy that nothing gets written down in a flow, right? So, the sort of problem with some of the 245T speeches is that they've essentially not become more efficient, they've just become faster and perhaps less clear, which has made it impossible to flow, and as such, the affirmative is likely to win. As a general rule of thumb, you want to front load your arguments because the first thing that you say is the thing that is most likely to get flowed, right? So having easy sound bites like neg flex outweighs aff flex, or limits outweigh, or there's no functional limit before you make your argument, and then numbering your answers makes it easier to transcribe your speech in frontline form. So for example, right, if they make an argument that the state's counterplane is a functional limit, you can say that states is not a functional limit. 3 answers, 1, 2, and 3. And the reason why you want to make it like that is if they do drop any of these, it's easy for the 2 and R to be like they dropped, the second argument, which was X, and it matters because of Y. Okay. The third thing about topicality, third thing about optimizing T in the 2 and C is that you should not have an overview. Should not have an overview. T overviews are a colossal waste of time. Usually, it kind of looks like re-saying every sentence in the 1 and C and then making an additional limits argument, which is a considerable time investment because it is literally the amount of time you spent making your initial argument in the 1 and C to be repeated on multiple parts of the flow. So scratch all of your T overviews. Instead, you should start on 2AC1, right? The interpretation and violation arguments that you were going to extend in the overview can be extended on a we meet argument or a counter interpretation. The limits argument that you were going to make in the overview should be extended next to their best offense to force you to contextualize and explain why limits outweighs their offense. And the voting issue argument can be extended on competing interpretations or their counter interpretation, right? So whatever you have in an overview, not very helpful. There's no judge really after looking at a 1 and C on topicality who's going to be confused about what it is that you're saying, right? This is not a critique. It's not psychoanalysis. You don't need to redescribe all the parts of topicality to a judge. That's something that you can, place on different parts of the line by line. Liam asks, what should we put on competing interpretations? So, so for example, if you make a voting issue argument that tends to be in a T overview, that's a place where you can make your voting issue, right? So you can be like, they say reasonability, but topicality is a voting issue. Competing interpretation is how you should, understand this debate, et cetera, and just make the argument where it matters, essentially. Because reasonability is the part that's essentially suggesting that topicality should not be a voting issue because it was reasonable. Okay, the fourth sort of suggestion for optimizing a 2 and C is about the counter interpretation. So debating the counter interpretation is very important. And I think you must, I'm going to include a couple musts for really sort of fixing the way that you debate this. The first is, on topicality, you must read additional cards. If you're not reading cards, you're losing. You should be reading cards that do the following things, okay? So before I sort of go into this, one thing I think is important is you must read cards, but you shouldn't just read the same cards. So if you're on T and ACT, right, you shouldn't just read 100 definitions from the dictionary about enact. It's like, we got it the first time. Enact meant legislature. Those additional cards didn't help. That being said, you should read additional cards that sort of add a couple of things here. The first is you should read cards that add legal precision. Okay, you should read cards that add legal precision. I'm going to use T and ACT as an example here. This is the place to unload on cards from different sources that add credibility to your argument that enact denotes legislative action. So for example, let's say an affirmative is an executive agency affirmative. If the 1NC reads a card that's quoting Clement, which I think is that initial DDI packet, who was the former Solicitor General, right? The 2NC is the time to read additional cards from different sources that establish legal precision. Bar associations, federal court decisions, US code, etc. Right? So you want to sort of add to the claim that you have legal precision that's not just making the same argument, but is coming from a different set of sources that complement sort of your initial claim. The second thing that you must read cards on is cards that add description about what the affirmative is instead. So cards that add description about what the affirmative is instead. So using enact as an example again, right? Finding a card that says something like enact is legislative, and if people meant executive, they'd use the word regulate or administer, right? Is something that helps you establish an intent to exclude. So having pieces of evidence essentially that are just like, not just enact is legislative, but a secondary set of cards in the 2NC that are like, if you had meant a different actor, you would have used X word, is something that is very helpful. The sort of last thing that you might have a set of cards about is a card that discusses not just what the counterinterpretation says, but what it implies about its model of debate. So a card that discusses not just what the counterinterpretation says, but what it implies about the model of debate. Oftentimes, you'll see counterinterpretations that don't have an intent to exclude from the affirmative. So, for example, they'll say things like the courts enact things all the time in the 2AC. You can read cards about what their interpretation implies. So, for example, the right evidence that enacts, that equates enact to doing as opposed to legislating opens up X, Y, and Z affirmatives, right? So, the right evidence says enacting law doesn't just include legislation, but rules, legal principles, and precedents, which implies that the 2AC counterinterpretation does not just include courts, but includes what rules are, what legal precedents are, right? Legal principles are that are not just court-based. So you can make a set of limits argument about what their card implies about its model of debate, not just what has been stated in the tag of the counterinterpretation. So, reading cards about these are the set of people who can make rules in the federal government. These are the people who can set legal principles in the federal government. Might be able to establish sort of a better limits claim than you might have otherwise. Okay. Now that we've talked about the counterinterpretation and reading evidence a little bit, the next sort of section that I want to talk about is how you might establish your limits argument. So we've talked at length about why limits is the standard for topicality. There's a couple of ways that you can make your limits arguments better than you might otherwise. Generally speaking, my suggestion for a limits argument is to put it next to the most important offensive argument, or where they say something like you've over-limited or you've stopped affirmative creativity. Okay? And on limits, you have to do two things to make a persuasive 2NC. So first, you want to make a case list of affirmatives that are plausible under their interpretation that should not be included. So a case list of affirmatives that are plausible under their interpretation that should not be included. One of the pitfalls of case lists is that a lot of times people will make examples that are so out there that simply no one will likely read, right? So, reading like a set of examples that are just like, you allow for, the racism is bad affirmative. It's like, no one really reads that. People usually make a set of solvency arguments. So you want your sort of examples on the case list to be a lot more realistic. And these are sort of ways that you can do that. First, you can read a card on this question. So I think one thing that's sort of underrated is cutting a card on limits that denotes the number of affirmatives that could exist. So think about T and ACT. My suggestion, if you want to make T and ACT work well, is to cut a card that denotes the number of executive agencies that are related to law enforcement, or maybe if it's like T civil versus criminal, it might be like the number of crimes that exist that allow you to sort of generate and be like, these are the set of affirmatives that you would allow, right? That explode sort of the burden of limits that's, they explode sort of the research burden that need to be limited, right? So yeah, a card would be awesome. Even without a card, I think listing the kinds of cases is good. So for example, if we're talking T-enact agencies, right, you might be like, enact includes affirmatives about, for example, the Capitol Police affirmative could be rewritten to be like, the Capitol Police will just stop being racist. They're an executive agency because they're part of the federal government, so we win. Or the IRS prosecuting tax crimes. Certainly an agency-based affirmative that could exist. EPA law enforcement being changed. This was a act that the AT Lab had considered before scrapping. So, those sets of affirmatives, right, allow you to sort of create a list of affirmatives that they would allow that you say should not exist. Once you do sort of the case list explanation, you have to then explain sort of why those affirmatives would not be good, additions to the topic. So, imagine a topic that includes, the Capitol Police restricting itself, the IRS prosecuting tax crimes, the EPA law enforcement changing. There's not really any core negative strategy that exists. So like, there's not really a core disadvantage that you could read against any of those affirmatives. And all of the advantages would be so diverse and unpredictable that it would be impossible to do sort of case-specific research against every one of those, agencies. The second thing that you want to do for limits is, so we talked about initially a case list of affirmatives that are plausible that should not be included. You should also have a second case list of affirmatives that you do allow. So the affirmative will likely make claims that the negative counter-interp over-limits, and that cases that your interp allows stand no chance against negative strategies like the abolition of the state's counterplan. As such, you want at least 3 or 4 examples of affirmatives that not only fit under your case list, but could be argued to answer some of their affirmative innovation key to stop negatives from always winning type arguments, right? So let's say that I'm reading T-enact as Congress only. I might try to come up with a set of affirmatives that have a good angle both against sort of abolition and the state's counterplan. So I might be like, there may be a set of Congress affirmatives that, change the standards on white-collar crime, which abolition would not be able to solve because it would remove all of those standards, and the state's counterplan perhaps isn't able to solve because of a set of solvency arguments that you can cut. Right? So making a set of sort of list of affirmatives that would avoid sort of their, state's counterplan will slay all the AF style arguments, while also sort of answering their AF creativity arguments is sort of a good look. So you don't want to go into the debate, not thinking about both of these case lists, which sets of affirmatives that they would allow that should be excluded, and which sets of affirmatives you would allow that are able to overcome things like, some of the, abolition and state's counterplan on this topic. Finally, for limits, you should have an impact to limits. Okay, you should have an impact to limits. Why does this matter? So it's obviously important because you need to sort of be able to make the claim that limits are sort of the thing that is prior to your ability to debate whether you're affirmative or negative, right? And I would forefront the claim that what makes debate unique is that it's a research-focused competition, and thus limits that break down research equitably and predictably across affirmative and negative is key to sort of operationalizing any of these benefits to debate, right? So as much as education and ground are nice, the thing that sort of determines those things is a predictable limit that has divided in advance, what the sort of division of labor for the affirmative and negative are. So that's sort of the set of things I would suggest doing in the limits claim. The last thing that I'll sort of say under sort of the 2NC is that you should know where to spend time and know where arguments are stupid, okay? So you should know where to spend time and know where arguments are stupid. The limits portion of the debate is obviously very important, and let's say you're doing your 245 topicality 2NC, right? My guess is that the limits section of that debate is pretty close to like 130, because that's the biggest, portion of the debate. Arguments like the wiki checks, this was a camp affirmative, those arguments tend to have zero persuasion, okay? So you want to sort of make sure that you're essentially sort of downplaying the arguments that tend to be very bad and spending time on the set of arguments that end up mattering, right? So in terms of affirmative arguments that matter, teams tend to want to go for arguments like functional limits. So arguments that are like the state's counterplan or abolition would be a set of negative strategies that check some of these small Fs. They tend to want to go for a set of arguments about affirmative innovation or flexibility. So they'll be like, playing your sort of hand so that the negative always wins is now very good, and the affirmative needs to have some level of creativity. And then finally, the set of affirmative arguments that tends to be popular is a set of education arguments. So, if it's T and ACT, that might be like learning about the courts is really important. And you want to make sure that you have a decent amount of answers on those, and less answers to the, this was a camp AF, it should have been predictable, you read negative strategies, so you should have known, right? Those arguments are not that persuasive, simply because most of those sort of defensive arguments don't really have any bearing on topicality. So for example, me able to read a disadvantage to a Korea affirmative does not make the Korea affirmative topical, right? It literally just meant I was prepared against that single affirmative. Or the fact that I have disclosed on the wiki my affirmative about space elevators does not make that affirmative suddenly topical, right? It just meant that I'm prepared to debate that single affirmative. And those sets of arguments, I think, should be downplayed. And the set of arguments about limits need to be the set of arguments that's upplayed. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the 2 and C. Let's talk about the 2 and R, okay? I think the 2 and R, in my mind, is very similar in its organization. So, you might have a very short overview, although I'm usually sort of a hack against overviews, that describes a important framing issue, right? So the 2 and R overview should not just be a re-extension of like, this was the interp, this was the violations, these are the standards, it's a voting issue because. No, instead you should pick one important issue. So for example, right, forefronting that the predictable limit standard that you made on the negative outweighs the affirmative standard might be a good thing to have in the overview, but beyond that, there's not really much else you need to include in there, right? So remember when I said like the interp violations and voting issues can be placed next to specific arguments, unless they have like a strong bearing on the decision that the judge is making, you should not be including all those things at the top of the debate. That really confuses sort of the flow of the debate. For the 2 and R, I think there's a premium on 2 main things. The first thing that there's a premium on is complete coverage. I think the one con of a T2 and R is that it's really unforgiving, okay? Like any little blip in the 1AR can blow up into its own 2AR. Judges tend to be fairly idiosyncratic on T, and sometimes are less forgiving about just like things that could have been extrapolated into other things. So, if the 1AR very briefly says the words afflex and the negative is like, we answer this, and the 2AR has a 5-minute speech of new arguments on afflex, there are a set of judges who are like, well, you should have guessed that that was coming, right? Which sort of requires you to really sort of down pat, close doors every time you're debating. I think that when you're making sort of topicality arguments in the 2 and R, one, you have to be extremely careful about flowing. So, you want to be very careful about flowing almost every word, every word, every sort of like debate thing that they say. So like, the words afflex is good might not really mean anything in the 1AR, but in the 2AR could be a, core part of the strategy, or them being like, you could have read the state's counterpoint, it could have meant nothing, but the 2AR will mean something. So you have to be very careful about flowing, and then make sure, once you've flowed it, to cover extremely carefully, right? Topicality 2 and R should spend all 5 minutes. And the reason why it's spending 5 minutes, despite only spending like, 2:45 in the 2 and C and maybe 30 seconds in the 1 and C, is because you want to sort of cover every little bit of things that they've said and close the door so that they can't go for it. The sort of other thing that I would do about a T2 and R that I think is fairly important is to study judge philosophies to make sure the sets of explanations you're making are catered. Some of your judges tend to like sort of this idea of there must be in-round abuse. I don't really agree with this, I think that sort of misunderstands what topicality is about. But for those sets of judges, it's very important to make a set of claims about, arguments that they've made in the debate that sort of change the trajectory of some of your topicality arguments. So, your T and ACT argument might be supplemented with a set of arguments about how they made sort of sets of permutations against agent counterplans, how they were able to avoid a set of disadvantages that you were making, right? And that's sort of an important part of the debate. Or if a judge philosophy is more about competing interpretations and about sort of the set of affirmatives that would be allowed under a certain interpretation, right? That obviously helps the negative, and they don't have to focus so much on being like the affirmative in this debate was so bad, and can instead focus on these are the certain sets of affirmatives that your limit would allow that would be dead, right? So reading and understanding judging philosophies and catering some of the way that you're describing topicality will go a long way. The last thing that I think there's a premium on in the 2NR in particular is clarity. So, topicality speeches in the 2NR are 5 minutes. That means that 100% speed is not where you want to be, right? You don't need 100% speed because obviously slowly saying the things you said in 245 of a 2NC will likely fit 5 minutes and perhaps not even. Like you might even have more time remaining, right? And remember, the point for a T2NR is to get every little bit flowed, right? So going slower and getting every word of your best arguments flowed is way more important than going faster and 4-point answering every argument that the 1AR made with the judge flowing a little bit of each point, right? That's dangerous. You should instead be like, here is the best argument I'm going to make on this section, and then really sort of like slowly explain to the greatest depth what your argument is. Other than that, I think the 2NR has some similarities with the 2NC in that you want to sort of do line by line coverage. You still want to do sort of the numbering thing. So, if you number in the 2NC, it's very easy for the 2NR to be like, oh, you dropped, I made 3 arguments in the 2NC on functional limits. You dropped the second thing. So I could be like, functional limits. This could be a 2AR if they didn't drop the second argument, which was X. And then you can sort of at length explain that argument, right? So the numbering thing is pretty important. The limits caseless stuff is also important, right? You want to describe some of the caseless stuff for the things that they would allow and the things that you would allow that allow you to sort of explain what their model of debate is. So making sure that you're sort of doing that extra work is super useful. I do want to sort of conclude this, section about optimizing and strategizing by saying that topicality is, in some ways, kind of a science, not just an art. So, it is something that requires a lot of precision and execution. It requires very careful flowing and requires you to debate in a very organized way. So, the worst way to debate topicality, 2NC and 2NR, is paragraph form. So you should not just be long form explaining your topicality argument. You should instead be debating topicality as if you were literally reading off of an outline of an essay, not the essay itself, right? So what I mean by that is, pretend as if sort of the 2AC is an outline of an essay. So it's like 1, there's a we meet, 2, counter interpretation, 3, those are all Roman numerals, okay? What you sort of want to do essentially is instead of just having a little paragraph for each thing, you want to sort of debate in subpoints. So you want to be like, 2AC1 was the we meet. We have X number of answers. Let's say we have 3, right? It's like 1, plan in a vacuum. 2, it doesn't meet. 3, even if it meets, it's extra T, right? And being able to sort of debate in outline form will help you sort of really precisely answer the set of arguments and really easily track what the affirmative has missed. So that's sort of my general suggestion about execution and strategy. Does anybody have any, so at this point I want to open it up for questions, either about specific T violations or just questions about T debating. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, concerns? And feel free to just unmute yourself and ask if you'd like. I'd also be happy to talk about T violations against some of your lab affirmatives if that's something that you're working on in your case next. Ishan asked, does this necessarily mean the 1NR should never take T, or is there a time that they can? I think the 1NR can take T. The thing that I'm sort of suggesting is that T should not be all 5 minutes of the 1NR, right? So, like, for example, you could take T in the 1NR alongside another position that doesn't take as much time. So let's say I took 245 to do topicality. I would include another sort of set of strategies that would only take about 215. So, like, for example, you might be able to take a certain advantage on a case and also take topicality, while the 2NC would take the other advantage, a disadvantage, and counterpoint, right? So like that's a possible block split. Ishan Momin asked, in the 2NR, is there a way to organize your speech like the first standards, or just go down the flow? So I think the way to organize it is to go down the flow. I think that the only thing that I would include up top, is either a set of concessions. So one sort of example of this is, let's say on T and Act, you were a little bit crafty and you read a bunch of definitions of other words that prove that they weren't legislature. So for example, let's say I'm reading T and Act as courts. In the 2 and C, I might read a set of definitions that's like, CJR also implies Congress. Sentencing implies congressional action. The word resolved implies congressional action. I've read all of those definitions, right? The 2 and R up top might be like, even if they went T and Act, you dropped all these other definitions that prove that they're Congress to voter for jurisdiction. Right? So like something easy that they've dropped. Or another example might be, let's say you like hit an extra T argument somewhere and they dropped it. It's like the top can be like, independently they've dropped the extra T argument. The debate is over. We're going to do the rest of the debate anyway. That's where I might put something up. The only other situation is if you think there's sort of a framing mechanism for how you might understand affirmative standard. So you might have like a brief moment where you're like, predictable limits is the thing by which you should evaluate their affirmative standard about education or ground. Limits outweigh, or neg flex outweighs act flex, or some sort of framing mechanism like that you might put at the top of the debate, and then you'll do sort of the rest of the work on the line. Someone asked, what is the best way to phrase the limits argument in the 1 and C? The best way to sort of phrase it is to describe in the 1 and C what kinds of affirmatives would be allowed. So you don't necessarily need a full case list, but you might include, so for example, for T and Act, I might be like, the limits debate, I might say something like, you allow for a set of affirmatives that includes 200 executive agencies and 108 federal district appellate and the Supreme Court, which is an agent explosion, and you might be unable to do research, right? So might have like a brief description of what is being added. And then the 2 and C, you can very clearly talk about this list of affirmatives that it might allow. So like the EPA example or the IRS example when talking about T and Act. Any other questions? I think I'm going through some of the ones in the Zoom chat. Lucas asked, what are your thoughts on T-policing? I think the difficulty of the word policing is that the definitions that exist for it tend to be pretty broad. So the weird thing about it is there's actually quite a few definitions that are like, policing is distinct from police. So policing is not just the same thing as police. Policing might include a broader set of technologies and cultures within police departments that need to be changed, which makes me think that a lot of times it's difficult to eliminate out sort of the set of affirmatives that you prefer not to have on the topic. That being said, I mean, I wouldn't say don't prepare the 1 and Cs. I just don't think the quality of the evidence really lines up with the thing you're saying. And then the other problem, I think, is policing is not really the thing that a lot of your negative research is coming off of, right? So it's not the fact that, so for example, right, let's say that you've won the argument that policing is only about decriminalizing certain actions. So affirmatives like the 1033 F that give them weapons but doesn't change the policing is untopical. It's like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because it's like, what is the additional negative ground, or what is the additional affirmative ground or the negative ground that you lost on the question of 1033, right? It's just like, So, my suggestion is, I think the best sort of 4 T arguments you're looking at on this topic are related to enact, related to bidirectionality in the US, and what was the 4th one again? I definitely forgot. There was, criminal, not civil. Those are probably the ones where you're looking at some of the best topicality arguments. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded. Any other questions?
I do have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
You said you have to add 2 minutes, and from the time spent on T and the 2AC, what exactly should you be going over in those 2 minutes to execute it?
So, my suggestion would be to essentially answer each of the arguments that are being made, and then establishing a set of limits arguments, right? Creating a case list for the set of affirmatives that your interpretation would exclude that should be excluded, and a case list for the set of affirmatives that you are allowing that allows for affirmative creativity and allows for the things the affirmative is saying is missing, right? So, the additional 2 minutes should be sort of the tracing out and describing of the limits, link, and impact portion of the argument. Any other questions? All right, great. Well, I am going to record this, and I think Jordana had a question. Is it beneficial to read T to garner competition, a counterplan competition, or does that give a head start? My suggestion is that I would read T and Act when it's very obvious that they are a court or agency have to begin with, i.e. they've included it in the plan text, or their solvency arguments seem to give off pretty clearly that the Supreme Court is key, so they've already essentially specified. If they haven't specified, I wouldn't read T and Act. I would instead read the set of enact arguments in response to sort of counterplan competition claims, right? So I don't think the issue necessarily is, does it give them a head start per se, but I do think that, a set of apps that just say the USFG should, that where courts is kind of implied, but not necessarily implied, it's like that T and Act debate is not going to go that well, but it would go well if you read it in a set of like counterplan arguments where if they're like perm to the counterplan will give you the court, it's like, oh, well, then you would violate T and Act and you can make that set of arguments that are in the 2NC. Yes, T and Act could go against every court's F. I'm actually fairly confident that against every court's affirmative and agency affirmative, you could read T and Act, and I think the cards are actually pretty good. Like, I used to not be a believer in this argument, but judging from some of the quality of the evidence that's been produced, I think the negative has a pretty good fighting shot. Alrighty. I think we can call it good for today. I'm going to put the recording up at some point. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to stick around for a second and ask them, and I'd be happy to answer them. But otherwise, feel free to have like your hour break until then. Okay, Ishan asked, what would I do if they do not specify the agent and T is your only option in the 2 and R? If they don't specify the agent, it would be rough if T and Act is your only option in the 2 and R. My suggestion would be to also in the 1 and C have read a counterplan, an agent counterplan, for example, of the courts and the executive, and then suggesting essentially that there are permutation argument that tries to avoid, so permutation do the counterplan that says that they are the courts or they are the executive is something that is untenable. So my suggestion is to have sort of a pincer approach that has both. I think just having one, so just going for T and Act versus USFG, plan is a losing strategy. Remy asked earlier, you talked about having impacts and limits and brought up research. Are there some others? Fairness-based impacts are sort of the best set of impacts for topicality, I think, right? The thing that makes debate different from just a discussion or learning about things or reading news articles is the competitive element of it. So you might make a set of arguments. It's like for a research competition to work, you need to be able to divide, a reasonable and equitable distribution of affirmative and negative ground, which is probably the way that you want to frame some of your impact arguments. And the research stuff is good too. Jordana asks, what is in the United States defined as? For the neg, this set of cards probably says something like in the United States is just the 50 states, not things like military bases, not extra territories, and definitely not things like servers that are in other countries, MLATF, right? So that's the set of like definitions that I'd be looking for on the negative. The affirmative is likely to make a set of counter interpretations that say in the United States expands beyond its geographic scope, or at the very least, the way that we should interpret in the United States is based on sort of the legality or jurisdiction of the United States. So instead of the geography of the United States in the states, it's just about like whether or not the United States has jurisdiction
I have a follow-up question about this. I just didn't feel like typing it.
Yeah,
Um,
you're good.
so, because I was talking with Clarman about this a little bit, and in the United States, because like the way the resolution's worded, it's like substantial criminal justice reform in the United States. Could the AF almost, I don't know like how dumb this is, but could the AF almost weasel their way out and be like, we enacted something in the United States, even if it applies outside of the United States?
Yeah, I think they can say that for sure, right? So I think like one way that, let's say like you're writing the case next to the MLAT app, I think they can be like the servers are outside the United States, but the warrants are served in the United States. So they might make a set of arguments like that. I do think that, the way to sort of maybe preclude this is to make a set of topicality arguments, both in the United States, but also of the area that they're talking about, like policing, and be like, policing needs to be street level plus in the United States. And then make the set of arguments essentially that are just like, if your interpretation is true, it would allow for things like foreign intelligence, the CIA and the NSA, essentially, because it's just like all of those are in the United States, but they're policing things outside of the United States, which would be sort of a terrible limit set on the topic. I do agree, though, with Klarman that the sort of like fine line for these definitions is pretty difficult. But I think the limits case is possible, for sure.
I guess I just have one more question about that.
Of course.
Is so for apps like MLATs, do you think it's a reasonable strategy, or do you think like it doesn't take much effort from the app to kind of tank it?
I think it's a reasonable strategy, and I think you just want to make sure that you haven't spent an exorbitant amount of time on it. Like, I think it's something that requires them to do some work to answer back, right? So, if I was NAG, my suggestion would be the 245 version of T policing and in the United States to answer that MLAT's affirmative is sort of like a good place to be because it probably forces the 1AR at least a minute, maybe a minute 15 to explain some of those answers. Hope that makes sense. All right, cool. If that's the case, I will put up the recording at the end of all this. So, yeah, have a good break and enjoy lab.